can't speak for everybody in Memphis. I can't speak for everybody gathering. But for me, I believe if that man had been white, you wouldn't have beat him like that night.
Another unarmed black man killed by police prompts outrage and calls for reform yet again. This as the United States commemorates Black History Month. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Black History Month is the annual United States celebration of achievements by Black Americans and a time for recognizing their central role in American history. But Black people still suffer from, among other things, chronic poverty, lack of resources in education, discrimination in the criminal justice system, and excessive use of force by police. After the recent killing of Tyre Nichols and more than 2 years after the murder of George Floyd, there's been little progress on federal police reform. Well, as you can imagine, there's much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Jason Nichols is a senior lecturer in African American Studies at the University of Maryland. Brandon Hogan is an associate professor of philosophy at Howard University. Also with us is Nyambi Carter. She's an associate professor in public policy at the University of Maryland and author of American While Black, African Americans, Immigration and the Limits of Citizenship. And Imani Cheers serves as the interim senior associate provost for undergraduate education at George Washington University and an associate professor of media and public affairs. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Imani Cheers, let's start with that brutal killing by United States police of Tyre Nichols. It was all captured on tape, on video. It was seen across the country, around the world. It was an outrage. Here is the Reverend Al Sharpton speaking at his funeral in Memphis. Let's watch.
Man said, I didn't do nothing. You kept on going anyhow. Why do they go ahead? Because they feel that there is no accountability. Why do we want to see the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act passed? Because then you have to think twice before you beat Tyre Nichols. You think twice before you shoot at someone unarmed. You think twice before you chokehold Eric Garner.
So, Imani, in the aftermath of that killing, we hear calls again for reform. We hear this all the time, yet again. We hear that police need more training from some people. Others tell us that there is a culture of violence, a culture of immunity among police forces. And if we look at what the United States Congress has done, it hasn't done very much as far as federal police reform is concerned. We still have qualified immunity. That's still on the books. Do you expect anything to change after this?
First of all, thank you for having me on this evening, and to my colleagues, thank you for being here as well. I think, unfortunately, Anand, what we've seen time and time again is that there is truly a lack of regard and respect for Black lives in particular, and it's really infuriating. I'm no longer sad. I am angry. I am outraged, as are millions of Americans, allies, advocates, and those who are constantly in the crosshairs of our incredibly broken police system. It is abhorrent. That video, if anyone saw it, I could not bring myself to watch that sort of trauma inflicted on that young man. But the reality is that this is a situation in the United States that is unlike any other country in the entire world. It stems, of course, from racism and white supremacy, but we don't see a call or actual actions happening to make change.
Imani, there has been a racial element to previous police violence against mainly Black men, but in this instance, does the fact that the 5 officers were Black complicate things?
I don't think it complicates things for me. And I know for a number of people that it does not meet. I mean, Freddie Gray is another example of a high-profile murder of a Black man. There are many times James Baldwin so eloquently quoted in the 1960s how that the fear from police was heightened when Black officers would show up on the scene in an attempt to perverse a way that they're looking at the badge. I don't think the racial element changes. I think what we're seeing is that white supremacy comes in all forms, in the system that we're working with, in which these police officers were practicing under and within, is the overall issue.
Jason Nichols, there was a Gallup poll that was done very recently, and it showed that 72% of Black Americans believe major changes in policing are needed. We've got the George Floyd Policing Act, which passed the House of Representatives twice, but stalled in the United States Senate. In fact, Senator Tim Scott, a Black U.S. senator who is part of the Republican Party, called it a non-starter. So what is it going to take to get any kind of meaningful change?
Well, I think it's going to take changing some of our elected officials in some of these places. I don't see really a path forward in the legislature right now. I think right now, of course, I don't think it'll pass the House, and it certainly won't get through and get 60 votes in the Senate. So right now, we're at a difficult spot. But I think one of the things that we're going to see, at least on Tuesday, at least I hope, that the President of the United States will make this an issue and start to really use his bully pulpit to make sure that Americans know how important police reform is, how it is so vital to a lot of communities, particularly Black and brown communities, to have safety from the people that they pay to keep their communities secure and safe. So I don't necessarily see that there's going to be any kind of legislative change in the future. In the immediate future, but hopefully, I believe that there will be changes, in terms of who we vote for, and that will lead to legislative change
Right.
level.
Right, Jason. As you say, there has to be a change in elected officials. Do you see it becoming a major election issue, not just when the president is addressing the nation in his State of the Union speech, but also at a time when elections are taking place, that this is front and center?
Yeah, I think it will. I think it should be. And I think one of the things that we're going to see, of course, we see the reshuffling of the Democratic primary process. I think that's going to be one of the early topics that people want to discuss. And that's one of the good things about changing that process, is that people in South Carolina want police reform. People in Nevada, Latinos, want to see police reform. They want to be treated fairly by their police forces. So I think that this is going to be a big topic for Democratic elected officials, and hopefully it will be a big topic moving forward for all elected officials. And we've seen Republicans, after Tyre Nichols' brutal murder, they're having to discuss it. Now, are they going to get rid of qualified immunity? I don't think so. Are they going to get rid of the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights in certain places? I don't think so. But they're certainly being made to address the issue, and I think that that's the first step.
Nyambi Carter, according to the FBI, Black Americans are disproportionately more likely to be victims of hate crimes than any other race in the United States. And also a survey done by Pew Research tells us that a third of Black adults worry almost every day that they might be threatened or attacked because they're Black. There are some who say that white supremacy should be declared a national security threat and that targeting Blacks should be classified as domestic terrorism. Is the government doing enough? Can the executive in the government do something about this?
Thank you for that question. I'm just going to have to go back to my colleagues here. I think we're talking about, whether we're talking about hate crimes, we're talking about police officers, and they're part of that domestic terrorism matrix. This is all how the sort of system was designed to work, which is to brutalize Black people, dehumanize Black people, oppress Black people. I don't think that this is going to be something that can be addressed totally by the federal government. As we can see, a lot of things that happen with police and policing are happening at the state and local levels. And I think we're going to have to start thinking more critically about redress in those places, because that's where we start, I think, to see a bit more movement, because for some of the reasons that Dr. Nichols just already pointed out, the calculation in Congress is very different. And we have a executive, quite frankly, who's made it clear that he doesn't really want to use executive orders to legislate. So he really wants to depend on his colleagues in Congress to do this work. But there is a lot of reluctance there to do that. And I think when we look at where we might seek some relief, or where we might see some cracks in the walls, mayor's offices are attractive places to go. City councils are attractive places to try to seek some reform. State legislatures, because that, quite frankly, is where a lot of the policing and the business of policing happens, not necessarily at the federal level. So this is not to suggest that the federal level couldn't be important here. They can be. The Department of Justice has been integral, at least pre-Trump administration, and in coming up with some consent decrees in other places. They were quickly rescinded, but we know that the federal intervention can matter. But I think when we think about who pays the salary of chiefs of police, who makes decisions around the budgets for police forces and things like that, city and local governments should also be held to account here.
That, of course, calls for accountability. So do you see some kind of a diverse campaign, state by state, to change this?
I think it's going to have to be. I mean, I think the George Floyd Policing Act was important in terms of like data keeping and having the information we actually need to correctly assess the information, because what we've been talking about here are the murders by police. But one of the things that the Tyre Nichols case pointed out, but also others like it, Freddie Gray and others, is the amount of brutality that happens that isn't reported on. We talk about the things that are spectacular, but the everyday ways that people are disrespected and brutalized in their communities, doing basic tasks, just living, breathing, standing on their porches, I think is something that we don't pay enough attention to. And I think this Justice and Policing Act will help us get closer to a real diagnosis of the problem. But in terms of accountability, I mean, I think that's one of the things that police unions and others have been very good at getting around, is this accountability. I mean, we saw so many cases where police officers, in the case of Tyre Nichols, many of those officers, 3, I think, out of the 5, had already been disciplined for a range of unbecoming activities, and yet they were still allowed onto the streets in this specialized unit that seemed to have very little oversight and a lot of leeway to go after the citizens of Memphis. So I don't know that accountability is going to be in our very near future. It's certainly needed, and I think if police officers had to carry liability insurance the way that doctors do, we might have a slightly different ball game here than we do right now. But I don't see that in the offing, because police unions have been very good at making sure that their officers are protected and get around this accountability hurdle.
Brandon Hogan, when Joe Biden was running for the presidency, candidate Joe Biden, he promised to address the issue of white supremacy if he became president. And of course, it was very convenient at that time, because we remember that time it was black voters in South Carolina that put him over the top and gave him the nomination in the Democrat Party. But in the meantime, hate crimes are on the rise and the racial wealth gap is widening. So has Biden lived up to any of that promise?
It's hard to answer that question straightforwardly, because it's not clear what living up to that promise would look like. Right? White supremacy is an idea, and it's not clear to me what someone in the executive office will do to combat an idea itself. And I think I'm kind of skeptical of the idea of legislation being the answer. We had the post-Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, we had the Ku Klux Klan Act, Voting Rights Acts, Civil Rights Acts, and we're still in the same position that we're in. So I think, to the extent that Joe Biden could do, what Joe Biden could do as an executive, I think is going to be insufficient, right? Executive orders, acts, proclamations, I don't think is going to undermine the idea of white supremacy. I think the real concern is going to be people who embrace the idea of white supremacy willing to give up on the idea themselves, or seeing it being in their interest to give up on white supremacy. For a lot of people who are either explicitly or implicitly white supremacists, it benefits them. It's rational for them to be white supremacists. It's rational for them to impose black voting rights. It's rational for them to oppose affirmative action. So it's going to be the case that those who benefit from white supremacy are going to have to change their hearts and minds for us to see a change. I don't think Joe Biden or the legislature or Congress in general is going to be able to do anything to undermine white supremacy. I think history has borne that out.
Would it help, Brendan, if he talked more about it, if he brought more attention to it, more of a focus to it, not just when we see the latest outrage, when a black man has been brutally killed again, but at other times as well?
I don't think so. All right. So if it's the case that I benefit from an idea, I benefit from a system, someone tell me that a system is problematic, I don't think for the majority is going to matter. We had a black president that spoke for 8 years about racial justice, demonstrated racial justice, showed the promise of racial justice, and America, at least half the country, responded by electing someone who was at least implicitly white supremacist. So I don't think the addresses are going to matter. I think it's going to have to be something that has to do with the interests of the people who benefit from white supremacy.
Yeah. Imani, what are your thoughts on this? I'm going to cite yet another survey that was done, which showed that a third of black voters say Biden is not sympathetic to their problems.
I'd be curious to know where that survey came from. But in particular, I would say that, looking at, the first 2+ years of the Biden administration, and we will hear tomorrow, of course, he's going to lay out and tout accomplishments. Hopefully he acknowledges the numerous areas of improvement and the places he could go, in particular around what I believe is legislation. I'd have to disagree a bit with my colleague in the fact that I am pushing for, I want to see change in the form of legislation, in form of elected officials who are going to actually speak for the communities that are continuously and constantly brutalized by our policing system. And so I understand the will, quote unquote, of the people, which is where we had the horrible 4 years under Donald Trump. But when I'm looking and seeing how the ability to be emboldened by white supremacy, it is an action. White supremacy is a series and systems of policies that play out very, very, very clearly in not only the founding of this nation, but the way in which our systems operate with its most historically marginalized and vulnerable populations. So I would think that, whether it be the percentage of African Americans who are feeling that, the current president is not utilizing his platform at the time to speak to their issues and concerns, I think it's our also point to hold him accountable as we continue to do, hold the vice president. We are at a point in that a stalemate in our government, and I think that's going to be where the challenges come in.
All right, Imani, I want to stay with you and talk about education. Of course, this is key, but if we look at what's happening in education right now in Florida, after heavy criticism from the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, the College Board in that state has got rid of the names of many writers and scholars who are associated with critical race theory and black feminism. Here's DeSantis talking. Let's listen to him.
In the state of Florida, our education standards not only don't prevent, but they require teaching black history, all the important things. That's part of our core curriculum. This was a separate course on top of that for advanced placement credit. And the issue is we have guidelines and standards in Florida. We want education, not indoctrination. If you fall on the side of indoctrination, we're going to decline. If it's education, then we will do.
So DeSantis, of course, is a Republican governor in Florida. But what is the governor up to, and why this purge?
It's pretty clear for anyone who's really been paying attention to politics over the last 4 to 6 years what Ron DeSantis is doing, not trying to do, what he is doing, the legislation that he has pushed forward, and the way in which he is, very intentionally, very boldly decided to literally declare war on not only African studies, African American studies, and the true understanding of the actual history of the United States of America, and the intentionality to remove areas what he calls critical race theory theory is not taught in high school. It's not taught in high school AP courses. It's not taught in elementary school or middle school in any of these places. Critical race theory by Kimberly Crenshaw is taught in law school. And I think we need to remind audiences of that, because it's the CRT buzzword that gets people freaking out, that the whole curriculum is based on making white children feel bad about the horrific and honest things that a section of white people did in historically and contemporarily. And so I think it's very challenging to see what he's doing, but it's very clear. Very clear. This is not smoke and mirrors. Ron DeSantis knows exactly what he's doing to set himself up for the 2024 presidential run.
Jason Nichols, DeSantis has come under some criticism in Florida. Let's listen to a Democrat from the Florida State House. This is Fentrice Driscoll. Let's listen to her.
He is undermining the rights of parents and students to make the best decisions for themselves. He wants to say that I don't belong. He wants to say that you don't belong, whose story does and doesn't get to count. But we are here to tell him, we are America.
So, Jason, is this ultimately about votes, about elections? Because, of course, DeSantis has already said that, at least there is speculation that he might be running for president in 2024 as well. But is this something that's going to appeal to American voters?
I think it will appeal to a segment of American voters. One of the things Ron DeSantis has been very effective at is fighting the right culture wars in order to capture the imagination of the MAGA faithful. And he realized, this whole fight over quote unquote critical race theory started with a guy named Christopher Rufo. And Christopher Rufo is quoted as saying, critical race theory was the perfect villain. So this isn't really about about education or anything like that. And of course, we know Ron DeSantis has, transported migrants and done all these things because he wants to capture the MAGA crowd. And he sees that perhaps there's weakness with Donald Trump, and he wants to be the next Republican nominee. And he has a very good shot. This also isn't about erasing Black history. I think that's one of the misunderstandings. It's not that he wants to erase Black history. It's that he wants to pervert it. He wants to change the context, just the way we've seen where Dr. King, we're taking him out of the context of being a radical socialist, a radical democratic socialist, who was against militarism and anti-poverty. We make him into racial equality Santa Claus. And that's basically what they want to do with all of Black history and all of Black contemporary education. And so that's essentially the goal of Ron DeSantis. And we're hoping that at some point, College Board or someone is going to stand up and say, no, these are valuable conversations. You can't take out Audre Lorde from African American studies. It's just ridiculous.
Nyambi Carter, have there been any positive changes? I mean, we've been talking about a lot of what is wrong, but I'm thinking particularly of the fact that there is now a Supreme Court justice who is Black. That's Ketanji Brown Jackson. If we look at the unemployment numbers for Blacks in America, that has gone down. We have Kamala Harris, who is half Black, half Indian. She's the vice president of the country. I mean, would you call that progress?
I mean, I think that's progress of a sort. I mean, I think that, we've had a Black Supreme Court justice for a while, Thurgood Marshall, Clarence Thomas, now Ketanji Brown Jackson. These, I think, exceptional firsts are always important. I don't think anybody is poo-pooing that. But I think when we look at the broad strokes of what Black life looks like in this country, it's not all, a happy song. And it's not to suggest that Black people are sitting around humdrum and joyless. But it is saying that there's a lot that's happening in Black communities that need to be addressed. I mean, we've been talking about police brutality, but when we think about air pollution and air quality in our communities, I mean, Black people care about the environment, right? The environmental justice movement started with Black people. When we think about our likelihood of building wealth, right? I mean, you talked about the racial wealth gap earlier, but when we think about home ownership for Black communities, which is still rebounding, our communities are still undervalued. I think there's a lot that is happening in Black communities that are critical and need our attention. And it doesn't mean that we can't pay attention to the good things, right? I think it can be a both and proposition. I think it is. But I think we also need to be careful to not say that these exceptional people who are doing things that are really, I mean, kind of once in a lifetime things for other people. I mean, most lawyers in the United States will not be judges and will not be Supreme Court justices, right? But those people matter and they're important, but I don't think we should forget that there are also these other things that we need to be keeping our hand on. So I think there are lots of people who felt proud of Kamala Harris, who felt proud of Barack Obama and all of these sort of Black people who were able to do something really exceptional. But I think many of us are thinking about the lives that we lead and looking at the cost of eggs right now and thinking, how are we going to afford this? How do we take care of elders? How do we address, these really big gaps in our community around food insecurity and other kinds of things that unfortunately we have to be preoccupied with.
Brandon Hogan, I've got a little bit of time left, but each year at this time, of course, Black History Month, we take stock of the status of Black Americans. What would your assessment be right now?
I guess it's hard for me. I don't do that because I think about it all the time. But I think in this case that we're kind of in the same position we've always been in, which is a mix of positive and negative. We see the negative things. We see police brutality. We see the unemployment rate. We see poverty. But we also have a fight. We have a pushback. It's the case that Ron DeSantis is working very hard to undermine the education of high school students in Florida to get to not a fake attack on critical race theory. We also have a very positive pushback. I think the things that you mentioned, Kamala Harris, Ketanji Brown Jackson, are positive things that we can look to, especially Ketanji Brown Jackson, because even though she's in a minority on the Supreme Court, she's writing opinions and dissents that are going to be in the record forever. Right? So it's going to be the case that she's planting a seed that can turn into something big in the future. And I think that's something to be happy about, be optimistic about.
Imani Chairs, I've just got a little bit of time left, and I'm looking at the political situation. I mean, if we look at it, Black Americans make up 14% of the population here in the United States. That is a significant voting bloc. Why doesn't that voting bloc hold the mainly white leadership in political parties up to their promises?
I think it does, actually. There are, if you look at across the demographics in the United States, it is definitely, African Americans in particular who are key voting blocs to success. I mean, you talk about South Carolina and Joe Biden, most recently in 2022. That was a perfect example. So I think they are. I think it depends on where they are. Black women in particular are also an incredibly loyal voting bloc, constantly showing up time and time again and coming to numbers in polls. So I think I would say that we are holding them accountable. Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia,